Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many of you joining us at Applied Linguistics Intersection for our first webinar of the series. And we're really thrilled that we're able to offer these several webinars to you this year that focus on the multifaceted TESOL identities and featuring several of the articles in the recently special topics issue on TESOL identities. Our first presenter today is Dr. Quenisha Charles, who will talk about her work and present her article on Black teacher of English in South Korea, constructing identities as a Black native English speaker and English language teaching professional. Dr. Charles will take over and talk to us today, and we will monitor the chat and the comments and collect the questions. And at the end of the presentation, we'll make sure there will be several minutes to engage with the audience and answer the questions. And just to introduce ourselves, so Bahi and I, so I'm Polina Vinogradova. I'm the co-chair of the Applied Linguistics Intersections for this year.
Hi, I'm Bahi Hardaker, co-chair of ALIS this year as well.
Okay, and Dr. Charles, the floor is yours.
Okay, good. So good morning, everyone. Like she said, my name is Dr. Quenisha Charles. I'm currently located in Louisville, Kentucky. I'm an assistant professor at Jefferson Community and Technical College. If you want to reach out to me, my email is here below. I hope the videos are not impeding the view of my email. But my email is quenisha.charles@kctcs.edu. So that's the best way or the preferred way to reach me. So just like she pointed out, I'm going to talk about Black teachers of English in South Korea, constructing identities as a native English speaker and English language teaching professional. This study was published in the TESOL Journal back in December. However, this study is only a snippet. It's a part of a larger study that was conducted back in 2016. So can everyone see this? I see the videos on the right. I just want to make sure that the videos aren't impeding. Okay. So the objectives for today are to highlight the teaching experiences of 2 Black native English speakers working in South Korea and the ramifications of race impacting their pedagogy. Like I said before, this is only a snapshot of their experiences. This is not meant to homogenize the experiences of all Black teachers in South Korea, nor to essentialize the experiences of these 2 teachers. So this is based on my encounter with them for approximately 30 minutes and their response to a survey. I also plan to explore the perceived privileges and marginalizations of these teachers. And this is not the language that these teachers used. It's the language that I'm using to interpret their experience. I also plan to discuss the meanings and complexities of being an English language teaching culture ambassador. And lastly, conceptualize accountable training, policies, and practices that embody race and culture within ELT. So let's continue the conversation. Just some background information about me. So I'm from New Orleans, Louisiana, born and raised. I moved to Atlanta, Georgia, and I attended a historically Black college and university, Clark Atlanta University. I did my undergrad in psychology. Shortly afterwards, I was wondering and thinking to myself, how do I get paid to go abroad? I wish to travel the world. So I Googled, how do I get paid to travel the world? And the first thing that came up was teach in South Korea. So I said, that sounds interesting. So I had no background experience in teaching, but I went ahead and I completed a certificate. It was for, I believe, 100 credits, teaching English as a foreign language. And I also completed the certificate for business English. Shortly afterwards, I was contacted by a recruiter who is with the Korean-sponsored program EPIC, English program in Korea. And then not too long after, I found myself in South Korea. So once I got to South Korea, I attended the orientation for EPIC, and I noticed that I was one of the few Black individuals within that program. So at orientation, it was approximately, I don't know, 75 to 100 teachers, and it was definitely less than 10 teachers who were perceivably Black within that group. So I said, okay, this is an interesting space. Maybe what I'm doing, it's not for me. So I had this sense of not belonging because I didn't really see myself represented, right? So soon afterwards, I befriended one of the teachers, and this teacher introduced me to this group called Brothers and Sisters of South Korea. So this is the picture of this group. This group here, it shows 6,000 members, but it has grown to more than 13,000. And being within this group has really helped me get through my time in South Korea. So I was in South Korea from 2010 to 2013. And whenever I would experience microaggressions in the classroom, students asking me if I knew any criminals, students curious about my Afro-textured hair, things of that nature. Just anything I would experience, I can always vent within the group or share my experiences. And I was surprised to see that there were other teachers who also shared my experiences. So I found solace within the group. And also, I was happy to see that there were so many people who were just like me within this group. So going in, initially, I thought, okay, this isn't a space for me. But once I joined this group, I realized we are here and we are present. So in 2010, like I said, I joined the Korean program or program in Korea. Then in 2011, I pursued a master's in education with specialization in English language learners because I wanted to know how to better assist my students. Then soon after I completed my tenure from 2010 to 2013, I joined the program, doctorate program in composition and TESOL. And while I was there, I realized that there was a lack of academic scholarship that talks about the experiences of these teachers working within South Korea, particularly within the TESOL paradigm. So that kind of inspired my study. It inspired me to study these teachers' experiences because I did not see myself. So there's a lot of scholarship where we're focusing on whiteness, where we're focusing on Westerners, but the individuality and the characteristics of these teachers pretty much gets removed. So a lot of the scholarship was a dichotomy between native English speakers and Westerners versus non-native English speakers and non-Westerners. So I really did not see myself within that context. So even in my doctorate program, I thought to myself, maybe this isn't for me. So I found myself asking that question, or, telling myself that maybe this field isn't for me as well. So a lot of the scholarship where I found myself, I would have to go outside of TESOL and look into other platforms like education in the US and things of that nature. But TESOL was just something that I really felt disconnected to. So I said, you know what, I'm going to forge this space here, and I'm going to highlight these teachers' experiences to show that we are here and we are present and we are contributing to English language teaching. So another thing was that I was unaware of how students are learning and making sense of the English language and cultures from Black teachers because of my experience and what I went through. And I just want to be clear, I really did enjoy my time in South Korea, but there were a few instances where I felt like I had to focus on race within the classroom. And I talk about that a great deal in my dissertation titled Black Teachers of English in South Korea. And I also talk about how students told me they felt after learning about these particular cultures and this particular knowledge from where I'm from and my cultural background. So I wanted to see how other teachers are influencing and affecting and teaching students. So I do want to also be clear that my study is limited. And it's limited because I did not do any in-class observations. A lot of my data is based on what the teachers told me. Also, I did not interview any students. So I am limited in that way. All right, so the framework that I'm using is critical race theory as a lens. So Critical race theory is a framework coming from the US. It was developed during the civil rights era in response to inequitable education that was affecting primarily people of color, namely Black. So this is a Western ideology, but I'm going to show how it applies to English language teaching. So there are several tenets for critical race theory. However, I'm going to focus on three. The first is counter storytelling, pretty much highlighting the experiences of those who do not identify as white. And Chandel Nero, she talks about hierarchical structures within the native English speaking paradigm, in which prioritizes or idealizes white as at the top of the hierarchy of native English speakers. So they're the most preferred and they're the dominant discourses. So a lot of the discourse and literature is centered on them as being white native English speakers. So just like I was saying before, I wanted to highlight the experiences of those who identify as native English speaker, but is not white. Additionally, it highlights whiteness as property. So one example is the E2 visa law within South Korea, where you must be from one of the 7 countries within the Occident in order to qualify or be eligible as an English teacher. So these countries are predominantly white. So there's a subtlety that implies that this space, this area, this job, this career within South Korea, if you want to teach, is for whiteness, right? So the implication or the caveat is that these countries are very diverse and there's a lot of white, non-white, but of course the majority are white who are coming from out of this space. So that's what I mean by whiteness is property. And it reinforces this idea of native speakerism, native and whiteness being idealized, being most suitable. They're the most appropriate to teach students. And I problematize that a little bit later on and also within the article. And also it exposes permanence of racism in a society. So one example is inherent beneficiaries. So I think all of these kind of run parallel with one another, or they're all interconnected, because if the visa laws are, excuse me, if the visa laws are there that in order to teach English, you must be from one of these 7 predominantly white countries, then that maintains this permanence of whiteness and racism. So white individuals are the inherent beneficiaries of it. So if individuals who are learning the English language are consistently seeing white individuals being promoted and marketed as the native English speaker, then the cycle continues. It's a permanence of this racism. So what I'm attempting to do is show that it's not just whiteness who are in the English language teaching field. And if you are familiar with the ideology within TESOL, there's a lot coming from out of TESOL within world Englishes, English as an international language. A lot of this is problematized, but it goes to show that there is no single group that owns the English language. So in addition, I use narrative inquiry as a methodological tool to honor these experiences of these teachers. Clandon and Connolly talks about the 3-dimensional space in which continuity, looking at the past, present, and future experiences of an individual, is interconnected with the interaction, how you view yourself versus how others view you, and then the situation, the place where you're located, how that is also impacting how you make meaning of your lived experiences. So that helped me to determine patterns with my participants and also construct larger meaning. And essentially, both of them legitimize experiences and experiential knowledge. So English language education in South Korea, there's so much literature coming from out of this particular country. And I don't want to be unfair with my little my little bullet points. There's so much going on here, but I'm giving you a very truncated version. So globalization in South Korea is a real thing. It's commonly referred to as segwa. Historically, the idea is that globalization has been around within South Korea since the 1800s, with the English language education being incorporated into the system. Allegedly, since the Choson dynasty, native English speakers have been there teaching the direct method. And the direct method is pretty much being taught from the native English speaker through translation, grammar, very prescriptive approach. So that's the normalized way of doing things. However, post-method research has showed us that it's more complicated than that. And another thing, the actual image and the individuality and the characteristics of these native English speakers are unknown. So it's presumed white. These are white individuals who were teaching it. But moreover, billions have been earmarked by the Korean Ministry of Education to support English language education and English language teaching. It's compulsory from the grade school area, particularly I think it's pre-K or maybe first grade. So kids are learning the English language at a younger age, and many people feel that this is creating a dichotomous society where the students are losing, or kids are losing their heritage language because they're being introduced to it so early on. There are some parents who are actually getting their kids surgery, their infant surgery in their youth, so that they can actually develop English or acquire English proficiency earlier on. So there are also government-sponsored programs like the EPIC program that I went to or through, and also the English Village programs. This is a picture of an English village in South Korea. So the purpose, allegedly, of the English villages is to get kids and students immersed in an authentic background to learning the English language. As you can see, this is a picture of the Queen's Guardsmen, and the background is very Eurocentric. So all of the English villages are very Eurocentric, so it kind of reinforces this idea of what English is connected to whiteness, which is quite interesting. So all of the English villages, you'll see a very Eurocentric intake, and it's not taking into account that everyone around the world is using English as the lingua franca. So English is being linked to global citizens. So Koreans who learn the English language, they become or are considered global, internationally competitive. So more than likely, they're going to do well within society. So that's creating a privileged class and a non-privileged class. English is also fetishized as luxurious. So those who speak English, they're viewed as privileged, and they're viewed as speaking perfect English, and pretty much they're doing well off. So there's a lot of global hegemony of the English language imposed. Pennycook referred to those who are teaching the English language abroad as Anglo troopers, imposing linguistic imperialism. And Block talked about the 5 overlapping scapes of the English language. He mentioned finance-scapes, international banking with the use of the English language. He talked about technoscapes, technology, phones, things of that nature with incorporation of the English language. He talked about idioscapes, books, how we're learning about different cultures through the English language. He talked about mediascapes, how we're promoting the English language to our kids through media. And he also talks about the ethnoscapes. So studying abroad, international learning, international education. And many South Korean parents are sending their kids abroad to learn the English language. So the methodology, I used 2 participants from my study. Both are from the US, both are within their mid-30s. And keep in mind, this is a study that was conducted back in 2016. One of the participants has a bachelor's in music and more than 5 years of teaching experience. The other has a master's in humanitarian action with more than 3 years of experience. Data collection was surveys and semi-structured interviews via Skype. And this is what the 3DS looks like, what I was talking about earlier, the continuity, the actual interaction, and then the situation. So as you can see, the past recollection experiences as they relate to the teacher's identity with the present, and then the future, and then the personal, the self-perception as an NES and their pedagogical influences with how others are perceiving their pedagogy. And then the situation, which is the place. All right, so participant 1, Jamie, her my research questions are here, and I just pretty much copy and pasted her response from the survey. So when asked, how do you view yourself as an NES, she mentioned a cultural ambassador. I not only instruct in the English language that most people are familiar with, in example, standard English, but I also share the other dialects and accents that I am familiar with using. So here it seems like she's kind of contending with this idea that I do my job, what they're expecting, but I also show them that there is a variation within the English language and it's not just standard. Additionally, when asked what are the self-perceptions of yourself as an NES, Black NES and ELT professional, she again said, I see myself as a cultural ambassador. I have learned about as much as I've taught. With each new learned skill, I incorporate in my lessons, which help my students understand more and relate more to the world around them. So she's showing that she's giving students an outside connection. She's trying to build connections with students. She's going beyond this prescriptive notion of just teaching about grammar. So she's attempting to establish rapport with students by being this cultural ambassador. And then lastly, how does being a Black NES and any ELT professional influences pedagogy? She mentioned, being a BTE in South Korea, I have been the receiver of many compliments, insults, and misconceptions. Whether good or bad, my students open up to me. I am not only a teacher by profession, but I learn a lot about the world that I teach in, which is different from what I was brought up in. Each lesson helps me to understand how to interact with others in and outside of the classroom. So as you can see here, she's kind of centering on, although I experience insults, misconceptions, compliments, I take all of that information and I turn it into a teachable moment. So I'm consistently connecting with my students. I'm learning, I'm open to learning, but I'm also bringing it back to the classroom. So when I followed up with these participants for an interview, with regards to the first question, she says, and there is much more within the larger study, so I just took a few snapshots from it. She said, I give them kind of like a warning, like the America that you read in your books is not the America that I live. The America that you're thinking of, they do it this way. Now the America I grew up in, we do it this way. So it's like she's inadvertently telling students, America is not this monolithic concept or country that you're thinking about. There are many different cultures within America. There are many different contexts and demographics that you should be aware of. So she consistently contended with this idea that America is not a monolith. And then she said, teaching about different accents and dialect variations, that's what helps me to show students the diversity within the US. And then in the second question, she clarified by saying that it's all inclusive. My self-perception is that I am an all-inclusive teacher. To be a good teacher entailed including the English history and culture, as well as other cultures and other nuances that makes the language functional within the learning environment. Learning more about the Korean language and its linguistic semiotics to create lessons. So it seems like within the interview with her, she was more fixated on, well, I don't really want to use the term fixated, but she focused a lot on showing that I'm here to make connections with students. I'm here to learn about students' culture, but I'm also here to teach students about what's going on within my culture as well. And then when I asked how is it influencing pedagogy, she said, as an NES, she has a platform to teach about the English language and cultural associations. So she does that as an NES, but as a Black teacher, she felt responsible for teaching about cultural diversity, cultural differences, and her race due to a lack of representation. So that's what she said. She does not want the parents to think their kids are learning something useless or unimportant. So during our interview, she talked about how there's a lack of representation within the curriculum, but she also mentioned that she does not share with the parents that they're learning about Black history, because many of the students have vocalized and many of the parents and students have associated Black culture with crime and violence. And she pointed out that the media has a tendency to promote Blackness in that way. So she said that she was fearful of letting individuals know, particularly the parents, that the students would be learning about Black history, because she didn't want them to get the wrong idea or feel like it wasn't necessary. But she mentioned that in the classroom, students would say things like, why is your skin Black? You are from Africa. Students would try to toss pins in her hair to see if it would stay. And for some women, that's quite traumatizing, because long time ago, there was a history of, you know, this idea of colorism, where if your hair was not fine, then you were not privileged. So that's a whole different story, but that can be quite traumatizing. So she would talk about how she ran into some of those issues, and she would have to incorporate things about cultural diversity, differences in race, in order to better educate students. So overall experience, she says that it has not been a bad experience, but I can't say that everything has been smooth. My experience in South Korea is what led me to the self-proclaimed title of Cultural Ambassador. There is so much that is left out in education. I feel compelled to clarify perceptions when teaching. So when I viewed her overall sentiments, I thought she's privileged in the classroom because she's responsible for devising curriculum for comprehension expansion. So that's expected of her as the ELT expert, as the NES. She's a cultural ambassador of the US. So she gets to represent the entire US, which is very problematic, but within that point in time, she had that identity of being the cultural ambassador. And then she was placed in a position to learn more about Korean culture and linguistic semiotics to create lessons focused on cultural similarities. So to make connections, and I think that's a huge privilege. And I put an asterisk that she teaches English with a BA in music. She didn't mention that the school where she was focused on music, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say that music was not the focus, but she mentioned incorporating that into her pedagogy. So she was marginalized in the classroom by incorporating Black history unbeknownst to parents. So it seemed like that's something she had to sneakily do. And that's quite frightening if you have to hide your identity or who you are in the classroom out of fear that someone is going to reject you based on stereotypes alone. She was recognized as non-American due to her skin tone. So asking her if she's from another country, that insinuates that you are an inauthentic, illegitimate NES, and you're not who you say you are. So she said that she would combat this with telling students, you're from China or you must be from China. And that way she would open up a dialogue, because students would say, no, I'm not from China, and would be very proud to show their Korean roots. And that's when the conversation and dialogue would open up about what this means. Additionally, she said that she was forced to create lessons and have dialogue about race, stereotypes, cultural awareness, etc., due to those microaggressions exposed in the classroom. But nonetheless, she says that it was an overall great experience. So going to my next participant, her research responses were, how do you view yourself as an NES? She said, I'm a native English speaker of USA. So there are some sinister undertones with that particular comment, because it implies that the entire US, well, first of all, that the US has an official language that is English, and it doesn't. So the US does not have an officialized language. And there are many instances where there are individuals who are from the US who does not speak the English language as their native language. So that gets into other disciplines of bilingual education and so forth. So she kind of responded as if, okay, I'm from the USA, so that means by default, I'm a native English speaker. For the second research question, she said, I view myself as a professional in how I carry myself in the classroom and bring my cultural experiences into help teach young learners. So here she focused on experiential knowledge. I found it quite interesting that she didn't pretty much, when you think of professionals, you kind of think of the credentials, qualifications. She really didn't touch upon that much. She attributed much of her teaching to her cultural experiences, and she viewed that as most valuable. So when asked, how does being a Black NES and ELT professional influence your pedagogy, she said, it has allowed me to open the gateway to teaching about experiences and cultural aspects as an African American in a foreign environment. So she too felt like her culture was misrepresented, or there was a lack of representation. But it's interesting, and this is something that I just realized later on, how she's in South Korea, but she positions, instead of saying I am a foreigner in this environment, she positioned herself as the norm within this abnormal environment. So that's the interesting dynamic that I'm still grappling with. So within the follow-up interview, she clarified with the first question. She said, an NES can better assist students with improving their English accent and pronunciation, although local English teachers may be proficient at teaching basic grammatical structure. So as you can see, this is quite problematic. And then she goes on to say, it requires going beyond basic skills of teaching grammar and reading and writing. So here she focused on English accent and pronunciation as being one of the great qualities of the NES, but scholars like Hashru and Selby and Pennycook and so forth have all shown us that accent and pronunciation, it's a myth within itself, because it puts this blanket on NES having this one accent. So it doesn't take into account the variation of accents and pronunciations. For example, me being from New Orleans, we have a very different dialect and accent down there. And maybe if I travel to somewhere up north, they would not understand what I'm saying. So she kind of like puts this blanket statement on an NES, and we have to be very careful, because that is ascribed to native speakerism. Idealizing this native English speaker as this one particular monolithic culture or language. And then she says, local English teachers may be proficient at teaching basic grammatical structure. I can attest that within South Korea, typically the native English speaker is always consulted for speaking purposes, oral practice, whereas we are kind of excluded from the exams that focus on grammatical structure. So many of the students do pretty well when it comes to the written part of the English language, but when it comes to the oral part, that's when it gets a little bit complicated. But there's another sinister undertone when she says it requires going beyond basic skills of teaching grammar and reading and writing. So to me, that's kind of like a downplay on the qualifications and expertise of these teachers by referring to what they do as basic skills. While these are fundamental, I think, to learning the English language, I would not necessarily clarify this as basic. So this can be kind of condescending to someone who will take it as, well, you're just teaching the basic stuff, but I'm here with all of the good stuff like pronunciation and culture and things like that. So we have to be very careful in how we position ourselves within the classroom. So that's an entire hour to talk more about, but I'm going to keep going. The second one, what are the self-perceptions of two Black NES as an ELT professional? She said within the interview, someone who not only teaches inside of the classroom, but one who is also a cultural ambassador and brings forth unique experiences into the classroom, increasing students' awareness of cultures, particularly cultures within the US, and providing enriching experiential knowledge. Now, the reason why she focused on the US is because she said that many, if not most of her students, they had plans to study in the US. So she said that they would always consult her because she's lived in Chicago, she's lived in Detroit, and many students wanted to travel and study abroad in Chicago. So they would always come to her and ask her about her experiences. So she said that she had that leg up by being able to talk about those experiences. But we have to be very careful, because to some students who may not have many interactions with Black teachers, they probably view her interpretations of what Chicago is like as the norm, or as the default, and not taking into account the multicultural complexities within the city of Chicago. So we have to be mindful that there's always cultures within cultures within cultures. And then overall, how does being a Black NES and ELT professional influence pedagogy? She said, having the ability to enlighten students on certain experiences and stories of living in urban American cities, informing students that media depictions of Blacks, particularly African Americans, is only one perception of an entire race of people. And the reason why she said that, because in her interview, she went on to talk about how Blacks are typically portrayed as criminals or caricatures within the media. And she said that she uses a lot of media to teach students, but when students would see Black people on TV, they would probably say something, I don't know, make a rude remark or mention something about the teacher's hair or something like that and snicker about it. And she felt like there was a misrepresentation. So she would have to also bring about racialized pedagogy, or pedagogy that encompasses race and culture. So her overall experience, she said that it was quite the experience being a Native African American teacher in a Korean context. I was able to affirm respect as a teacher in the classroom for the most part, but I'm sure some students and staff were curious about me as a Black teacher abroad. So from my encounter with her, she mentioned how there was maybe a slight sense of skepticism about her being there. So that maybe can be ascribed to her identity of maybe she's not a true or authentic Native English speaker because she's a Black individual. So we would have to think about that a little bit more, and maybe she's illegitimate to be here because she's not the ideal white and Western person that they expected. So she was privileged in the classroom to be the cultural ambassador of the US, a resource for students seeking study abroad experience in the US. She also had the liberty to teach about any topics in the classroom and raise awareness about African American culture. She did not blatantly experience racial microaggressions or tension in the class. So from my talks with her, she mentioned that she really did not experience any type of racial microaggressions. She said that a lot of that was media, where she had problems with racial microaggressions. Additionally, I felt like she was marginalized in the classroom because students indirectly linked African American and Black culture with crime, thus consulting her as the expert. So a specific example, she said that the student came up to her and asked her, will he get shot if he studied in Chicago? So that, you know, I'm gonna be frank, it's quite an asinine question, but she said that she wanted to be open and honest with him. She just felt like he was concerned because of gun laws. So she told him, you know, about the demographics and that he has to be careful, but she doesn't believe that he would be shot. So she said that she gave him recommendations on where to live and how to maintain safety. But what made me say that is because of my experience in the classroom. Students asked me if I knew any gangsters, and I couldn't help but think, are they also asking my white counterparts if they knew any gangsters, or is it just me because of who I am? Much of her teaching experience from my Skype interview, she centered it on being a survivor coach to students interested in studying within an American urban city. So to me, it sounds like they kind of viewed her as, okay, you are a legitimate Native English speaker, the students that is, but and you are more likely to know about crime and violence. So it was kind of like an underhand compliment. That's how I view it. That's not necessarily how she perceived it. All right, so within the discussions, research continues to show that Black educators are forced into positions where they must denounce stereotypes, be positive representations of their culture, race, prove what they're not, and consequently be cultural ambassadors both abroad and at home. So my question is, what does it mean to be an ELT cultural ambassador? There are several meanings. The one that I chose to adopt was someone who metaphorically adopts many roles, such as a window to a different world, an explorer, a traveler. And I adopted this particular definition because I felt that that's what I saw in my participants as they were telling their stories. The complexities of this is that history and culture is socially constructed and historically dependent. So the question becomes, whose culture? African-American culture in itself is not a monolith. So like I said before, there's cultures within cultures. It's contingent upon the demographics, your region, where you're from. Being from New Orleans, we have a very different culture from maybe the rest of the US. So whose culture gets represented? How accurate is it being represented? The generation of the teacher is also important. So we don't want to essentialize, particularly I'm speaking to Black teachers if you're in the room, we don't want to essentialize our culture as this is how it is and this is how we are, because that's a risk that students, because they're not on a daily basis interacting with African Americans, they may come to view that as a fixated idea of African Americans. And then the question becomes, we don't want to provide a prescriptive approach on how to teach about African American history and culture. So it would take some strategizing and some collective working together to see how we can talk about our culture in a way where we're not recreating stereotypes. And there are more complexities, I'm sure. So the conclusion and concepts. So one of the implications of my research is to encourage Black teachers of English to be more cognizant of their role as cultural ambassadors, who they represent and what they represent. We don't want to reinvent the wheel of imposing our culture onto others. And that would be also ascribed to native speakerism, feeling like we are the cultured ones and we are there to educate the uncultured. So we have to be very careful of that. So what I talked about is seeking purpose by implementing effective pedagogy. And I put that into quotations because effective is going to be contingent upon your context. However, I feel like if you have a purpose, then you're able to analyze and strategize the steps you need to take to make your pedagogy effective. So this can happen by recruiting. If you're there to teach about maybe, I don't know, African American culture, say within Chicago, how are you going to do that effectively? Are you efficient enough to where you can do it by yourself? Maybe you can get other teachers involved, bring in some additional voices. How are you assessing whether this pedagogy is effective? Some pre-assessments, post-assessments. So it does take a lot of planning. And then how are you determining effectiveness? Are you going to get students involved? So there has been research from Yazan and Rudolph that talks about having stakeholders involved. If you're there to educate someone, maybe you should also see what they understand and what they would like to hear more about. That way it doesn't seem like we're imposing ourselves because they have an interest in it as well. And after all, they are learning the English language. And I talk about hiring credentialed teachers. So I think that is very important as well. So not necessarily just going off of where this teacher is from. A bachelor's degree alone does not qualify one as credentialed. So like I said, when I started out, I had a bachelor's degree in psychology, but I also had TEFL certificates. And while I was there, I went on to get my master's and then my doctorate afterwards. So credentialed teachers mean teachers who are certified to teach. And I think this goes beyond just the circles of the 7 Occident, the 7 countries within the Occident, which is the US, UK, Australia, Canada, I believe it's New Zealand. The countries escape me, but these are the 7 white dominated countries. And I think that there are many experts coming out of other countries because the English language is the global language. So many individuals are specializing in English. So there are credentialed teachers outside of those circles. Developing meaningful curriculum. And what I mean by meaningful, I mean getting students involved and trying to understand their experience and how do they have a stake in your experience. So if we are in tune and passionate about teaching about our culture, I think there can be some exchanging of cultural teaching. So developing a curriculum where students are able to reflect about their culture, and we're able to reflect on our culture. Talking about how it's meaningful, maybe having a post-assessment of some sort, a reflection activity. What makes it meaningful? How are we defining meaningful? So that's why it goes back to purpose and always clear objectives, connecting relevant policies. So the majority of my participants within the larger study mentioned that they do not use English only policies within the classroom. I believe Nancy said that she does it sometimes for those who are more proficient, advanced proficiency in English, to keep pushing them. But you have to ask yourself, is that policy really relevant? And why is it relevant? How does it help? So I remember my time in South Korea when I was learning the Korean language, it was always a good idea to have English alongside of the Korean language. And I mirror that sentiment with teaching about the English language wherever, including South Korea. Ongoing ELT trainings with follow-up assessments. So like I said before, self-reflection, student evaluations, the list goes on and on for educators to not only strengthen their pedagogy and identity as an ELT professional, but also as a reminder of their purpose and whether that purpose is aligned with their established objectives. Oftentimes we can go off track. Sometimes some teachers, they have their bachelor's, they're really not trained. They go into the classroom, they really don't know what to teach, so they just start doing anything. But how can you assess whether your pedagogy is effective if you're not assessing it at all? So how do you know if you're improving yourself as a professional? How do you define yourself as a professional? Do you even have a purpose in what you're doing, or are you just there to have a good time? So we have to be serious about this. And the reason why I say that, because oftentimes when we come back to the US and we tell people we were working abroad, individuals sometimes think that we were just goofing off. We were not doing something very important. We were not adding or contributing to the English language teaching paradigm. So we want to denounce that myth and show that we're actually here and we're taking care of business and we're doing what we need to do to keep the paradigm moving forward, or to keep the field moving forward. So additionally, ongoing ELT trainings must be transparent and open to engage in dialogue regarding race and culture that shapes teacher identity and pedagogy. I know oftentimes within cultures, certain cultures and contexts, race is the taboo thing to talk about. If the majority of teachers are white, many times these teachers have the benefits of foregoing talking about race because they're the expectation to be in the class. So sometimes they don't have the need or are not put in a position where they need to talk about it. And even when I joined my program, EPIC, that wasn't the conversation within orientation. It was a very cookie cutter conversation of, this is Korean culture and these are some activities, fun activities you can do. So it didn't prepare me for these interactions about racialized issues. So I had to find this when I joined the Facebook group, Brothers and Sisters of South Korea. So we can do this by maintaining a census or a log of teachers and teaching activities. And this is for policymakers in Korea. How are we documenting what these teachers are going through? How do you know what these teachers are experiencing if you're not documenting it? And this kind of speaks to the idea of counter storytelling. We need this census in order to gauge the climate of the teachers we're hiring. Open call to host orientations. More teachers of color, particularly Black teachers, who can host orientations. Develop curriculum with teachers and students. So this goes back to having all stakeholders involved. If the teachers are not proficient or skilled in the Korean language, how can we bridge that gap? So getting some Korean teachers also involved. I remember my time in South Korea, usually I would get consulted on an individual base, and usually the Korean teachers would work together as a group. And then when the native speakers would have something, it would be all of the native speakers around the region going to the Ministry of Education to have something that was very fun-filled. It wasn't very, I don't know, classroom-based, I would say. Also, student evaluations. I think that's important. I don't recall getting or having students take an evaluation for my class. This is something that I had to carry out. So official student evaluations where teachers can see how they're doing in the classroom. How do we know we need to improve if there's nothing gauging where we need improvement? I think at the end of each term, you are either recommended by your co-teacher, Korean co-teacher, let co-teachers ask whether the native speaker or the teacher should stay or not. You don't know what's gonna happen, so you're kind of out of the loop. So there's this consistent exclusion of English language teachers from the classroom, and that should not be the case. And also, you know, English language teachers deserve to have that official student evaluations to improve themselves. Also, the opportunity for long-term contracts with room for growth beyond the classroom. So if we know that this is just a dead-end job where we're just only viewed as the native English speaker or the English language teacher who's there to make life fun for kids, why should we care? We have no purpose. So we have to be very careful with that. And showing teachers, you know, there is opportunity to advance within this particular system. You're not just here to teach. You can also do this. You can maneuver around with this. And these are some things that came to mind. There are more implications, I'm sure, and more things that we can think of, but for the sake of time, these are only the 4 that I outlined. Continuing the conversation. So this is what I posed as some reflection questions. I'm not going to go through all of these questions. This is just something to think about. But I concluded the study by calling for ongoing ELT training, language policy, and hiring practices that are keen on dialogue and deliverables, embodying race and culture. You know, and then I started asking myself, is the establishing of a census on teachers, hiring companies, and curriculum sufficient? Is there more that needs to be done? How realistic and feasible is this call for action? And would this be considered another hegemonic imposition from the West? So I'm always contesting and contending with the research I produce. But I'm gonna leave it there and I'm gonna open it up. Thank you.
That was a great talk, Quenisha. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences and your research with us. Why don't we have a few minutes for discussion, for Q&A. So if anybody would like to type questions in the chat or raise their hands so we can unmute your microphone so you can ask Quenisha some questions.
Mm-hmm. While people are thinking about the questions, I just want to make several comments. First of all, thank you so much. Absolutely. timely and extremely important talk. And as I am listening to you and thinking kind of with my TESOL program director hat on, and all of these themes coming up that, you know, they just constantly come up in the TESOL program, because it's so important for us to think how we are preparing our English language teachers. How are we structuring curriculum in the TESOL program? And, you know, it just, the other day in the class that I'm teaching right now, students were doing an online discussion, and the question of one student asked another student, so what differences do you see between the teaching approaches between Western teachers and teachers in China? So this Western teacher concept, even, it is so much ingrained in kind of lumping the cultures together and really having this, you know, white ideology. And I had to clarify to the students that, can we step away from this terminology? Not to say the question itself kind of problematic, this cultural comparison, we can talk a lot about that. But again, it seems that we need to explicitly work on incorporating this problematization of concepts that our students who are going to be teachers just throw into sort of the discourse, into the classes, without even questioning or thinking, well, what does it mean exactly? And again, there's so many themes that you raised for us today. And another one I just quickly want to comment on and give the floor to everybody else is the teaching pronunciation aspect. And in our program, we have a course on teaching pronunciation, and it's been kind of bothering me all these years and thinking that what ideological message it actually sends, whose pronunciation. And some of you were commenting, why do we even need to worry about teaching pronunciation? If we just step away from this native English speaker vision of someone who speaks the standard English and looks white, if we just think about, as many of you in the chat were raising the questions of ownership, who's English, that there's no need to have a class like this, or there's no need to put such emphasis on that. And you mentioned post-method, and I think that post-method to a certain degree can help us overcome this ideological stance. So I'm gonna kind of be quiet now and give the floor to everybody else. But thank you.
No problem.
A question from Bozadi. What can be done for ES teachers?
What is meant by ES?
ES, maybe the person meant ESL teachers that are Black. I wonder if the L was missing. Yeah,
What?
ESL teachers. What can be done for ESL teachers that are Black?
Can you rephrase the question? What? I'm not exactly sure what you mean by what can be done. So there's a lot of things that go, that's a very loaded question. So there are ESL teachers who are Black around the world, and I can't speak for the entire worldly context of what can be done. Like I said, going back to this idea of finding purpose in your pedagogy, seeking purpose in what you do, I think that's very important, and outlining clear objectives for what it is you're trying to attain. The
person added teachers that are facing discrimination.
Okay, and what type of discrimination would that be? I'm assuming that you mean these teachers who maybe experience microaggressions in the classroom, like my participants. So with my participants and myself, what we did is we found time to incorporate lessons that talks about cultural diversity and what's offensive within particular cultures and things we should avoid. So if your students respect you enough, they would want to listen and want to be careful not to go about their life the same way and do the same things. So that dialogue is important to exchange culture and understand where you are, and understand ways of going by with respect and respecting others. I hope I answered your question.
We have a comment/question from Kisha. So yes, because Black is not a monolith, a Black person with a US American passport might be less discriminated against than Blacks with other passports. Was this the case in Korea?
So there have been some talks about those who are not from the US having a hard time finding jobs within the South Korean context. Usually these individuals are from places within the African continent. So those individuals who do not hold some type of passport for one of those 7 countries within the Occident do encounter those type of issues. But, you know, in some instances, probably illegally in some hagwons, which are private institutes, for the sake of monetary purposes, maybe some companies will hire individuals and tell them to present themselves to parents as the native English speaker for their own personal gain. Of course, that would be legal, but it's not something that I would put past anyone. And the reason being is because I know someone who's from the Philippines working within a private institute, and she's told by her boss to tell the parents that she's from the US. So she's operating under a false identity. Even within China, sometimes race trumps citizenship. So although you should be from one of those, according to laws, although you should be from one of those 7 countries, sometimes if you're white, you know, you are viewed as an English speaker and you are idealized as such, so you get the job. So there's a lot of complexities and things within this entire paradigm. So that's what I mean also by relevant policies as well. So I talk about that from a pedagogy standpoint, but even within laws, is it even relevant? There are many individuals who are experts within the English language teaching in countries that are not the US, not the UK, and are unfortunately being discriminated against because they don't hold that citizenship status. So it's irrelevant, but it upholds racism, permanence of racism. Usually individuals who are not from that country are viewed as people of color. Usually the non-native speaker is associated with someone of color and someone who is not white. So that is contributed to the idea of the permanence of racism, upholding whiteness. Whiteness is property. So that's why it's important for our stories to be told, because we're not operating under whiteness, not to my knowledge.
Mm-hmm. We have another question from Mahjabeen. Great work, Quenisha. Your research suggests that there needs to be more dialogue and communication among NES teachers and non-native English speaker teachers. What do you think?
I think it's true, but I think others have come before me who have already started this. So there is the NS movement, non-native English speaking teachers. You can find them on Facebook. Also, Selby, within my research, let's see, myths and misconceptions, but he also has an article that talks about the non-native English speaking teacher movement that calls for allyship of native English speakers and non-native English speakers working together to ensure that there are equitable practices within English language teaching, to ensure that there is professionalism. So we are moving past this idea of idealistic native English speaker and idealistic pronunciation and accent. We're going beyond that. There's also an idea of post-native speakerism and purging of the term native English speaker. So there's a lot of concepts out there, but I do agree that there should be more dialogue, but I also agree that this idea of the dichotomy between the two in many cases are more theoretically and more economically situated than socially. So what I mean by that is, say, for example, if we were to go attend a TESOL convention, you don't just see only non-native English speakers are hanging together and only native English speakers. I don't think it's that black and white. I think the problem becomes very complex when we look at the job market. This preference by parents, this preference by companies. So monetary gains, I think from an economical standpoint, and even linguistical standpoint from some parents and some students, I think that they create this dichotomy where socially, I think that natives and non-natives are consistently working together, and we've been working together for centuries now.
Okay, maybe this could be our last question since we're already 7 minutes past the time we're supposed to end. So last comment / question for you. So this is from Sheila. She says, when I was in South Korea, I was told unofficially by other Black native English speakers that it was hard to get a job in Seoul, that they were more likely to be in smaller cities or towns. Is there any way of discovering how true this may be, or the hiring practices of schools and hagwons?
There should be. So that goes back to my concept of establishing a census of some sort to understand or assess or gauge the climate where we are. So definitely more research needs to be had. So, you know, I think we need to go out there and see, you know, how hard it is. I don't really agree with that because it was not my experience, but that's not to say that it isn't true. There are many different factors that could be going into reasons why they were hired for smaller cities and towns. That's likely where teachers are mostly needed because everybody wants to gravitate towards the major cities. That's for one. But I think we probably won't know if it's true unless there's actual research that's done. So maybe a first starters would be the Korean Ministry of Education completing some type of census to see, highlighting the race of the teachers. I know this is a very Americanized concept when we talk about race and things like that. Many countries don't focus on race. In the case of South Korea, I don't think it's necessarily race that they view because it's majority Korean. So they're hypothetically coming from one race. So a lot of this discrimination is at the colorism level. But I think that the law needs to be adjusted or revisited to see how we're making sense of who gets these jobs. And that can begin with the Korean Ministry of Education or even us, you and I as researchers, those who are coming into the field of TESOL. That's something to definitely explore.
Right.
Thank you.
All right, we can probably stop here. Thank you so much for everything, for sharing your experience, your research, answering our questions. Paulina, would you like to also
just thank you to everyone for joining us, and thank you, Dr. Charles, for this excellent, thought-provoking presentation, and the number of comments indicate that. And just wishing great day, nice weekend to everyone, and please join us for our other webinars as well. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
All right, thank you so much again. Thank you, everybody.
All right, bye-bye.